Another very powerful modeling command in the 3ds Max toolset is the lathe. It works by taking a line and spinning it, usually a full 360 degrees. The technique is ideal for creating most shapes that are symmetrical, like a lamp base, or a table leg, or maybe a drinking glass. Each of those would serve as a perfect example of what you might create using the lathe. Now, before demonstrating the actual command, there's a few things to be aware of when performing a lathe. First is the importance of what the line ought to look like that you plan on spinning. And not just how the line should be drawn, but where, in other words, what viewport it needs to be created in. The line itself should look like a profile or outline of the shape that you're wanting to make. Now, because the line will be spinning all the way around, in other words, 360 degrees, you only need to draw half of your shape's profile. Another important issue is that the spinning action, once the line is drawn, needs to be done in the proper direction. Typically, that to-be-lathed line should be turned in the same direction that a toy top would spin. This animation illustrates that spinning direction. That's really all there is to it. As long as you draw the profile right and make sure the line spins in the proper direction, everything turns out as planned. Now, to give you a better idea of how you'll want to draw your line, I'm going to use this image of a bottle to illustrate how you'd create a curve that represented half of the bottle's profile. This image was provided by the good folks at 123RF. I'll now activate the line command, drawing half a profile curve on the right-hand side of the bottle. Pulling that curve over to the side will give you a better idea of how that looks. If I now get in the modifier list and apply the lathe modifier, you'll see the results. So that's pretty much all there is to it. Why don't we try making one for ourselves? This time we'll create something that has an opening or hole in its top, like maybe a vase. Now I'm going to want to draw my line in the front view, so I'll activate that window, then take it full screen with Alt-W. Okay, things might be a little bit easier for you to visualize if you try to get in the habit of using the heavy vertical line on the grid as the location from which your line is going to spin. Let's do this. We'll find our shapes in the command panel, we'll activate the line command and begin drawing. Now I'm going to start my line at the bottom of my vase. So up against the heavy vertical grid, I'll go ahead and set my first vertex. Now when I pull to the right, I want to be careful as far as how far I go over. Think about this, when the line ends up spinning around, your vase is going to end up being twice as wide, or twice as fat if you would, as how far you're now drawing from the center. So be careful, I'm only going to go over about maybe 4 or 5 grid squares. I'll set another vertex, then head up farther onto the right-hand side to bend things around. Now in finishing off the top, I'm not going to come back to the middle line. I'm simply going to right-click my mouse to end the line command. I'll explain this a little bit more in detail coming up in a couple moments. Okay, let's go to the Modify column and we'll find the lathe modifier. Now, once the lathe has been applied, you're going to immediately feel like you've done something wrong. You haven't. What's happening at this point is the line, which we want to spin from the far left edge, is actually, by default, spinning from the middle. We can make the needed adjustment on the right-hand column down in the Align category. Now in those options, clicking on Center will make the line spin from the exact center of the line that we created. Clicking on Max will have our line spin from the right-hand edge, and clicking on Min, our solution here, will have our line spinning from the far left edge. Okay, now that we've got that in place, let's go back to 4 views. We can now activate the perspective view, taking it full screen. Once done, I'm going to roll my wheel back so I can zoom out just a bit. Okay, now I'd like to see the actual geometry inside my lathe. Let's put on edged faces with the F4 shortcut. Over on the right, we can now adjust our detail either higher or lower using the number of segments. Above segments, experiment with changing the number of degrees. What's nice about this is that it can be animated. Let's now turn off our edged faces and orbit to the bottom of the vase so we can inspect that. For the orbit, use the Alt middle mouse wheel combo. Now as you can see, the bottom of the vase is pretty well jacked up. The reason for this is as the lathe is performed and all the lines spin around, they're all meeting at the center of that bottom. If we can somehow connect all those lines together, it should solve the problem. We can do that. Back on the right, under degrees, we'll click on Weld Core. Now we can orbit back to a straight-on position. Below Weld Core, you'll see a button named Flip Normals. Now before experimenting with that, let's go ahead and render our scene. We'll go to the upper right-hand corner of our toolbar and click on the teapot icon. When surfaces in 3ds Max are created, they're designed to only render one side of the skin. If you find when rendering that your surface looks like the skin has been turned inside out, well, that's where the Flip Normals comes in. Back on the right, go ahead and check the Flip Normals option. This, in essence, flips the skin inside out. Go ahead and render again. Now, there's a specific movie on surface normals a little later on in this title. The reason I bring it up now is because when lathing, the normals pointing one direction or another can become a problem. So if you render a lathed object and it seems like the skin's been turned in or out, well, just go to the right and experiment with the Flip Normals command. For this one, we'll go ahead and turn it back off. What increases the flexibility of the lathe command even further is the fact that you can go back and change the shape of your object, in this case the vase, by simply going back and changing the shape of the original line that you used to make the object. Watch this. We'll take things back to 4 views. We'll then activate the front view, then move into the modifier stack on the right. When we get there, we'll open up the line, going down to the vertex selection level. Now this gives me the opportunity of actually going back and changing the shape of my original vase line. I'm going to select one of the middle vertices and move it around. In doing so, watch the result once we go back in the stack and click on Lathe. It has changed the shape of our lathed object. Now what's nice, if we go back to the vertex level, is below the stack we have an option called Show End Result. Turning this on will allow us to work at the vertex or sub-object level while still viewing the end result. With that on, we can now go back and make our changes, and we can actually see them interactively as we work. Now, a little earlier, I was mentioning how when drawing the original line for the vase that I didn't want to close things off back at the top. If we would have added that last little segment on our line, taking things back to that heavy black vertical line in our grid, well, it would have closed up the top of our vase. Let's see if we can't work on a quick example that'll illustrate that point. Here we are back in our front view. This time, when drawing the line for the vase, we'll add that little extra section right at the end. We'll start at the bottom, draw our way up. Then, instead of ending at this point like we did the last time, we'll come back to that heavy grid line. Now think about this. What that extra line does is close off the top of our vase. So once spun around, there won't be a hole for flowers, water, potting soil, whatever else. Let's see if that's the case. In the modifier list, we'll add the lathe. And just like last time, we'll go down to the Align commands, clicking on Min. Let's now take it back to 4 views. Well, that's exactly what I was talking about. Look how the top of our vase has now been sealed. So when lathing an object, if you want that resulting surface to have an opening at its top or bottom, well, when you draw your line, plan accordingly. You'll also find situations from time to time where you'll need to either change the direction that your drawn line spins, or you'll have to spread apart an object after it's been lathed in order to create a hole that goes completely through that object. An example of something like that would be this tire, which has been provided by 123RF. In drawing the line, we'll end up spinning to create our tire. We'll need to think what a very thin cross-sectional slice of that tire would look like. Kind of like if you took our tire into a sandwich shop, walked up in front of the meat slicer, rolled it in from one end, and cut the rubber into a thin slice. What we'd end up with would be the shape of a U. Let's go ahead and draw that. I'm back to my front view being full screen. Now to offer a little more precision when I draw my lines, this time I'm going to activate the Snap option up on the toolbar. You can click on the icon or you can simply use the S shortcut key. Now over on the right, we'll get back to our Line command. This time you'll notice when I drag my mouse around, the line seems to be snapping to the grid intersection points. And that'll work out perfectly as the lines on my tire I'm going to want as straight as possible. Now before drawing the tire, let's reposition ourselves on the screen. Put your mouse at the crosshairs of the grid. Now hold your wheel down and simply push the mouse farther up to the top. All this is doing is giving us a little extra real estate to work with, now using that heavy grid line as the top of our tire as a reference. To start, I'll drop down to the lower left-hand corner of the window, clicking to create my first vertex. I'll then drive straight up to the heavy black line, click again, we'll draw to the right, We'll click, and then we'll go down the same distance. Now to end the command, I'll simply right-click. In order for my tire to not have sharp edges where the rubber meets the road, I'll go in my modifier stack, getting into the vertex selection. I'll also turn off my snap by typing S. Now, the two vertices that you see at the top of the window, Windows select both of those. Back in the Modify column, we'll now drop down to the Fillet command. Using the fillet, we'll be able to round off these corners. Activate the command, put your mouse on one of the two verts, then pull away. Okay, once we've done that, we now want to provide a thickness to our tire. Not side to side, but the actual thickness of the rubber itself. To do that, we'll select the line as a spline. We'll then use the Outline command over in the Modify column to double up on that line. Now, the important thing to know here is that the distance between the two lines is going to end up being the thickness of our rubber. Okay, once we've done that, we can go ahead and apply the lathe modifier. Now, before going any further, let's take things back to 4 views. To center our work, we'll then use the Shift-Control-Z shortcut. Okay, now up until now, all we've needed to do to make things right is to change the Align command. Let's see how that works. Well, neither of these options seems to do the job, so let's go ahead and take the Align back to center. No, the trick to this is actually in the direction that it spins. As opposed to spinning our line as if it's a top, we want to instead spin it like a Ferris wheel. We can do that by going to the Direction commands. Let's try Z. Inasmuch as it looks like we're going in the right direction, we're not. We're going to have to try another option. Let's try Y. Well, that simply takes us back to where we were. No, the answer to this is changing the direction to X. Even though our tire at this point looks like a cylinder, check out the front view. If this was the real world, this is exactly the orientation that a tire would be in. The trick to this is we now need to somehow spread where the spin actually originates from. We can do that back in the stack by opening up the Lathe command. Now go down to Axis. In the front view, grab the green stick on the transformation gizmo, pulling it down. Now keep going far enough so you open up a hole. Once that hole's been opened, go ahead and press Ctrl-Shift-Z. Take a look at that. Let's activate our perspective view, going full screen. We can now add a few segments, then we'll orbit around the tire. So in our example here, we needed not just to draw the line correctly, but we also needed to change both the direction the line spun and the location from the actual spinning axis point. I'll go ahead and save this up as tire completed if you'd like to take a look. Okay, that ought to give you just a few ideas on using the Lathe command. Anytime your scene needs something symmetrical, you've now got the perfect tool for the job.